Welcome everyone to this Minerva webinar. Today, we'll be taking a deep look at the shareholder voting trends and dissent in 2022. Applying Minerva's data from across the ASX 100, we'll be breaking down the key takeaways from 2022 in Australia and looking ahead to 2023. While this briefing will be focused on Australia, please do follow the link in the attachments below if you're looking for a review of the shareholder voting trends in the UK. Below you'll also find a full copy of the slides used today and several other resources that should be very helpful. My name is Alex Whitebrook, ESG Communications Manager at Minerva Analytics, and your host for today. And today I'm joined by our Senior Stewardship Analyst and resident shareholder voting expert, Thomas Bolger. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Alex, and thanks for the introduction.
Brilliant. So let's jump right in. Australia's AGM season takes place in the last quarter of the year. That's October to December. And with proxy voting for the season now concluded, and in fact, we produced a webinar not too long ago predicting the major trends of the Australia season. We're now on the other side of it, and there's a whole new year ahead of us. Today, we'll be covering the very same topics we covered in our preview last year, with added insight from the peak season now past, including executive remuneration, government action on climate change, say on climate votes, ESG resolutions and shareholder proposals, legislative action on greenwashing. So there's many topics to cover today. Let's jump right into things and bring the slides up into full focus for the audience. Oh, and a quick reminder to our audience members, if you have any questions for Tom or myself, please submit them below the video. Minerva's analysts collected a wealth of voting data in 2022, allowing us to put together the headline statistic here. Our analysis covers 88 of Australia's largest companies and a total of 96 shareholder meetings. These 96 meetings brought about a total of 608 resolutions and had a turnout rate of 68%. Among the myriad resolutions that we saw this year, there were several high-profile say on climate votes and management-supported proposals that saw high levels of dissent. In particular, Australian energy company AGL saw a large number of high dissenting votes, primarily in connection to its climate strategy. We'll cover all of this and more in coming slides, but first, Tom, how did shareholder turnout shape up in 2022?
Thanks, Alex. So in 2022, we did see a big increase in the shareholder turnout at AGMs in Australia, with the turnout levels now appearing to be on track for returning to the pre-pandemic levels. So when we look at the historic turnout figures here, we can see that 2021 did see a big fall in turnouts, and that is in part, largely due to the coronavirus-related restrictions on travel and social distancing. So in 2022, there's been an increase in turnout. That's in part due to the lifting of restrictions in Australia and the return to somewhat level of normalcy, as well as now the increased online participation in meetings. So during the pandemic, there were temporary provisions introduced by the government to allow companies to hold virtual-only meetings. But now companies are actually only able to hold virtual meetings if their constitution permits them to do so, as these temporary provisions lapsed, and now these boards have to seek approval to amend the constitution to introduce the rights if they don't already have it. So in 2021, several companies did put forward resolutions in anticipation of these new rules to amend the constitution and to provide companies the flexibility to hold these virtual meetings. However, some institutional investors do disfavour the holding of virtual meetings. And as in Australia, the Constitution Amendment resolution does require a 75% vote in favour. So in 2021, several companies actually withdrew the proposal, although many did actually succeed in the vote. So I think this question around turnout and electronic participation is particularly an interesting one in Australia, as there's ongoing debates over the use of online participation, and in particular the use of virtual-only meetings, and companies do need to provide a good explanation as to why such a meeting format is considered appropriate, and also ensure that the technology chosen to facilitate the virtual meeting ensures the democratic access for all participants and also open dialogue between shareholders and the board. But hybrid meetings which combine both a virtual and a physical format are still seen as best practice. And there's also a question over electronic participation and also technology developments is also an important topic at the moment in Australia, following a string of cyber attacks and also privacy breaches at a number of high-profile companies.
Yeah, I think the turnout increase is definitely expected with the return to normalcy you mentioned, as the pandemic well and truly becomes a thing of the past. But it's interesting to see that the impact, it's it's still having an impact on Australian shareholders to this day. Virtual-only meetings are somewhat of a hangover from the COVID era, and I think that they only really sound appealing on the surface. Perhaps those who are in favor of them are ahead of their time, but for now I think it's still quite necessary to have some in-person presence to discuss the many serious issues that are being covered in company AGMs. And you mentioned the backlash to virtual-only meetings in Australia. I think it's definitely related, as you mentioned, to cybercrime and the new cybercrime guidance released by Australia's Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. It's certainly a hot topic and something that companies and shareholders alike are very well aware of at the moment. Anyway, that's a topic for another webinar. With this increased turnout in general, how have the voting results turned out this year? Has there been an increase or decrease in shareholder dissent? Previously, we predicted that sustainability, both say on climate and shareholder proposals and remuneration, would be contentious issues in the market. Was this the actual case, though? Did this happen in 2022?
So when we look at the voting results for the season, we identified that there are 30 resolutions that received high dissent. But to explain what we actually mean by high dissent, Minerva calculates dissenting votes as votes not cast in favour of management recommendations. So, for example, if management recommended votes in favour, we look how many votes were cast as an abstention or as an against. The dissent is calculated by the proportion of votes against management's recommendation. And then a high dissent resolution is classified as a resolution that receives 20% dissent or more, although Minerva does consider a 10% dissent outcome to suggest underlying issues that should be looked at and addressed by both boards and investors. So going back to these 30 resolutions, we can see that just over half related to remuneration, around 60% concern sustainability, and around 30% were board related. So when we compare that to the previous year, 2021, in that year there were 42 resolutions that received high dissent. So there has been a decline in the number of high dissent resolutions in this previous season. And that's in part due to the lower number of shareholder proposals voted on and also receiving high levels of dissent in 2022. And also on the slide, you'll see that there have been 5 management proposed resolutions voted down by shareholders. However, 4 of those were actually board spill resolutions, at which the company would have actually recommended shareholders to oppose the resolution. So it was actually only 1 resolution proposed by management that shareholders actually voted down contrary to management recommendation. And again, if we contrast that to 2021, 10 resolutions were proposed by management were voted down by shareholders, of which 7 were remuneration reports approvals, 2 sought amendments to the constitution to introduce the ability to hold virtual-only meetings, and 1 was one of these board spill resolutions. So now we've looked at, say, what type of resolutions received high dissent, and they were still dominated by, say, remuneration. But now if we actually move on to the average shareholder dissent over time, we'll see that dissent has now declined in consecutive years. But when we're looking at the consecutive declines, if we go back to 2021, the average support on shareholder proposals actually increased that year from 12.87% in 2020 to 23.27% in 2021. And that's also a trend which we saw in other markets, such as in the UK and the United States, where 2021 stands out as a standout year for the level of support seen on shareholder proposals and also the number of successful proposals. Whilst in 2022, there's actually been a decline in shareholder support and shareholder proposals. And this has obviously then brought the overall dissent levels down with it. But this is also a topic which we'll discuss later on in the webinar in more detail as well.
Well, it is interesting to see just how much of a high 2021 was. Obviously, there are a lot of factors feeding into that, but it's good to see this decline in dissent this year. I realize that there are fewer contentious resolutions in general, as you mentioned, but if I'm not mistaken, this decline in dissent could also be a good sign of increased engagement by shareholders with issuers themselves. We've seen ESG skyrocket in popularity these past few years, and though it's having some growing issues and will continue to have these growing issues, more and more companies are getting on top of such issues before they come to a vote. Comparing to our UK analysis, it is the case over there that the majority of resolutions which receive high dissent regard remuneration and board or director issues. You mentioned that this is vaguely the same in Australia for this year, but which issues specifically receive the highest dissent?
Yeah, I do agree with you that Alex, but board and remuneration resolutions do seem to continue to dominate the high dissent resolutions. But on the table here, we've got the top 5 management proposed resolutions by shareholder dissent. So there's a bit of a mix of resolution types, but you'll see in Australia there were 2 saying climate resolutions, 2 remuneration resolutions, and 1 director election. So I think this aligns with our previous predictions also about the types of resolutions that shareholders are focusing on and are also resulting in high dissent. So just to quickly run through the votes here. At ALS Ltd, Siddhartha Kardia received high dissent due to shareholder concerns over overboarding, i.e. the number of other external roles held by the individual, which raised concerns with aggregate time commitments and also capacity to serve the role on the board. At Newcrest Mining, the remuneration report received high dissent, with a key concern relating to the alignment of actual variable pay outcomes with company performance. At Santos and Woodside, the resolutions that approve the climate transition action plans received high dissent due to shareholder concerns over robustness of their decarbonisation plans and alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement goals. So finally, at IGO, shareholders voted down the grant of performance rights and options to Managing Director and CEO Peter Bradford. And this followed the unexpected passing of Mr. Bradford just over a month before the AGM. And the board had proposed to continue to seek shareholder approval of the grant of these share awards to Peter Bradford's estate, and then to determine at a future point in time how the awards will be treated in terms of performance targets and also vesting conditions.
Well, there we go. I mean, remuneration is high up there, just as it is in the UK, which is not surprising, I guess. But I'm sure we'll get back to the rest of the issues covered in the high dissent votes. First, let's dive a little deeper into the remuneration issue specifically. What resulted from these high dissenting remuneration resolutions?
So I think when we discuss the voting results on remuneration in Australia, we also need to also discuss the unique voting system in operation in Australia, which is the two-strike system. So in Australia, there's an annual advisory shareholder vote on the remuneration reports, and under this two-strike system, a fair strike occurs when a company's remuneration report receives an against vote of 25% or more. Then the second strike occurs if the company's subsequent remuneration report in the next year also receives an against vote of 25% or more. And if a company does receive a second strike, they have to put forward a board spill resolution at the AGM. And if this resolution is passed, the company will be required to hold a spill meeting within 90 days of that AGM, at which all individuals who were directors when the remuneration report was considered at the most recent AGM will have to stand for re-election. And that's all directors excluding the managing director. So the idea behind this system is to encourage greater transparency and engagement on remuneration, as well as also greater director accountability when boards are unresponsive to shareholder concerns. However, shareholders do rarely, actually if ever, vote through this board spill resolution, which could suggest the system may have actually limited effectiveness, as shareholders may wish to avoid destabilising the board over remuneration concerns and therefore not actually support the board spill resolution. But an alternative view is that the strike system does actually encourage this engagement, with companies wishing to avoid a second strike and actually make changes and improve their disclosure to shareholders in order to avoid this when they receive a fair strike. So we can actually see that 2021 was a record year for the number of defeats of remuneration reports, whereas no remuneration report was actually voted down by shareholders in 2022. So this could be indicative of a two-strike system working, with the worst offenders responding to shareholder concerns and making changes to disclosure and remuneration structure. And then also when we talk about 2021, we also need to situate that within the coronavirus pandemic, where shareholders were looking for clear responses in pay and ensuring that executive experience aligned with the wider stakeholder experience.
Thanks, Thomas. Australia certainly has a unique example when it comes to remuneration. The two-strike system does seem to be working well. I think that your theory there seems spot on to me. If we had a record year of remuneration in 2021, it makes sense that companies would be a little more careful coming into 2022 with their remuneration reports. Before we move on to shareholder proposals in general now, though, I'd like to just point out that all of the analysis provided in this presentation today is available to our clients via Minerva's VoteWatch platform, an online voting results dataset for querying and screening voting results data going back over 25 years. Our platform is used by asset managers and asset owners, even academics, to better understand the voting trends of the past few decades. And if anyone would like to have a demo of the platform, please do get in touch with us after this webinar. So now let's discuss shareholder proposals and ESG. What has been happening in Australia and what kind of issues have been filtering through to shareholder resolutions? Are shareholder resolutions a common way of holding directors to account in the Australian market? I remember in our recent webinar on the UK's AGM season, we discussed how shareholder proposals are not prominent in the market, and there's been a decline in the number of proposals and the level of shareholder support for that matter. Was that the case here in Australia?
Thanks, Alex. So, yeah, shareholder proposals do continue to dominate discussions these days around ESG and also shareholder voting. But so when we look at the experience in the ASX 100, we can see that the number of shareholder proposals being filed has been steadily increasing over time, with 2020 being the record year in the number of shareholder proposals filed. In 2022, there are 30 shareholder proposals, so there has been a drop in comparison to previous years, but it still remains above 2016 to the 2018 periods. So the experience does seem to align with other markets, with a big increase in the last couple of years, but a fall in the number in the most previous season. So when we look at the type of shareholder proposals being filed and voted on in Australia, ESG issues do dominate these resolutions, with shareholders showing a particularly keen focus on climate change. There's also been a number of proposals on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights, engagement, and also cultural protection in the markets. In addition to those two, there's also a number of shareholder proposals filed actually to amend the constitution.
Right. So as we've discussed in the past, it seems that shareholder resolutions are, similarly to the UK, a small but significant area for shareholder activism in Australia. But have they seen much success in making changes within companies? And I realize there's been a lot of controversy with a particular few companies in Australia recently. Have they managed to make much change?
Well, when we look at the outcome of actual shareholder proposals in Australia, we need to also, similar to how there's the two-strike system, there's also a unique feature of Australian markets in regard to shareholder proposals. And that's that management powers in Australia are typically vested exclusively with the directors. And the courts define a shareholder resolution as a decision of the company. Therefore, shareholder resolutions are actually considered binding on the company, and they're therefore subject to supermajority requirements, i.e. a 75% vote in favour. So this makes it hard for shareholder proposals on ESG issues to pass. So as a company's constitution actually governs the decision-making rights for shareholders, as a result of this, there's actually routinely resolutions filed by shareholders seeking an amendment to the constitution in order to introduce the right to propose advisory resolutions or to express an opinion. So filing this constitution amendment request gives shareholders the platform to also propose advisory, non-binding resolutions on other matters such as climate change at the same meeting. However, the feature of this is that these advisory resolutions are conditional on the constitution amendment resolution being successful. And as then the constitution amendment requires a 75% vote in favour, this is actually unlikely to be reached, and no such request is actually passed as of yet. So because of this, the advisory resolutions, say on climate change, will fail even if they receive a majority votes because they're conditional on the constitution amendments. So what we have tended to see in the Australian market in our previous years, that generally only shareholder proposals that receive the backing of the board actually tend to pass. Although we did see an exception to that in 2022, which we'll come into, and that's relating to the AGL board director elections proposed by shareholders.
These rules make Australia very unique in its interactions between shareholders and management. Have they impacted the effectiveness of shareholder proposals in Australia? And what have been the general voting trends on shareholder proposals in recent years?
So the voting trends on shareholder proposals in Australia do appear to align with what we've been seeing elsewhere, such as in the United States and also the UK. So as we mentioned previously, in 2021, there was actually a notable increase in the number of votes cast in favour of shareholder proposals, and in particular on an increase in support for these advisory ESG-related shareholder proposals. So just to look at the 2021 voting results to put this into context, so average support on the Constitution Amendment resolutions did remain low at around 5.8% on average, but the support for these advisory ESG-related shareholder proposals increased from 21.71% in 2020 to 35% in 2021. But now when we look at the 2022 season, the Constitution Amendment proposals tended to receive a similar level of support as previous years, 5.3%, so it's a very similar level to 2021. But these advisory ESG proposals, of which either relate to climate change or Aboriginal rights, actually received only average support of 19.10%, so a big drop from that 35% in the previous year. So I think to consider this decline in support on these, say, climate change and other ESG proposals, we've actually observed that in these other markets, as aforementioned, the United States and also the UK, and there's various factors contributing to the decline. So I think there's a few points to make here, so that shareholder activists may have been emboldened by the success in 2021, resulting in actually more ambitious proposals being filed in 2022, particularly on climate change, there being more requests for actual targets and policy, rather than simply asking for greater transparency and reporting. Also, a number of environmental proposals were actually withdrawn following agreements between boards and shareholders, resulting in these more ambitious proposals being left on agendas. Connected to this, some institutional investors clarified their voting approach going into 2022, saying that they may vote against proposals which are considered too directive or seen as micromanaging the board. And then first-time proposals tend to receive low levels of support until boards and investors become more comfortable with them. And then finally, the last point to make is that there was also a different political and economic environment that the AGM season took place in, with the war in Ukraine and also the crisis in the energy market impacting voting decisions around climate strategy and the need to ensure short-term energy security. But again, outside of these, say, constitution amendments and these advisory ESG proposals, in 2022, there were actually 4 shareholder proposed director candidates, all of which received majority support. And that's despite the board in question only backing one of these candidates and they all took place at AGL Energy. So whilst there is this decline in support for shareholder proposals in 2022, there was a standout case at AGL.
It's incredible to see how global this shift is. We covered exactly the same decline in support for shareholder proposals in our UK review last month. I think that one thing that's been especially interesting to see is the decline in support for these climate-related or say on climate proposals. Kind of honing in on the AGL example that you mentioned and that I mentioned at the top of the webinar today, what can we learn from these high-profile cases of climate dissent, such as AGL?
So yeah, Alex, I do think that the standout story in the 2022 Australian season is this overhaul of AGL Energy's board. This was due to concerns over the company's climate risk management and also a shareholder campaign led by tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes. So AGL is actually Australia's largest greenhouse gas emitter. So the voting results will clearly place pressure on other large emitters to accelerate their decarbonisation plans. So at AGL's AGM, 4 directors were proposed by shareholders and all 4 were elected to the board, despite AGL only supporting one of the candidates. So that means that 3 dissident candidates were elected. So in addition to these shareholder proposals, AGL also received a fair strike on its remuneration report, and over 30% of the shareholder ballots also dissented on the approval of its Climate Transition Action Plan, i.e. these saying climate votes. So when we look at this AGL board overhaul and also engine number one successful campaign at ExxonMobil in 2021, there could be a new focus for climate change shareholder activists that seek strategic change at companies by actually changing the directors who run the company. And also when we think about Exxon, in the United States, there's been recent amendments to Universal Proxy Card, which also may encourage more dissident shareholder director candidates being proposed, which could make for interesting times ahead and a new way for shareholder activists to actually campaign over ESG issues. So whilst these four shareholder proposals are all governance related as they concern the composition of the board, the filing of the proposals and actually the voting results as well were informed and led by concerns over climate strategy. And this is also a trend that we've seen on executive remuneration, whereby voting is increasingly viewed through an ESG lens.
Thanks, Thomas. I think the AGL case raises interesting questions over director accountability for climate change, advisory say on climate votes, and also what resolutions shareholders should focus engagement and voting on. So in terms of say on climate, that is the management proposed resolutions to approve a company's climate transition action plan. What has been happening in that front in Australia? I believe that 2021 was the first year in which shareholders voted on these resolutions. And how has that initiative played out in Australia moving into 2022?
Yeah, so Alex, you're right that 2021 was the first year in which shareholders voted on these resolutions. However, there wasn't actually any resolutions on this in 2021 in Australia, but rather we saw several companies make a commitment to hold, say, on climate votes in 2022. So globally, there were votes in 2021, but in Australia, 2022 was actually the first year in which shareholders voted on climate plans. So that's meant that climate transition plans have been an important area of focus for engagement and voting this AGM season. So whereas in other markets, such as the UK, there were votes in 2021, but the number of votes held in other markets has also increased in 2022. So 2022 has been a standout year of saying climate votes, and we expect that the number of votes will increase again in 2023. So analysis by Minerva of global saying climate votes found that no company actually received shareholder dissent of 20% or more in 2021 on these climate votes. So the voting results do suggest that companies were being rewarded by investors for being first movers on saying climate and for their commitment on transparency and engagement on climate, rather than for the actual strength of their transition plans. However, shareholder dissent on saying climate votes has increased in 2022, suggesting that now the resolutions are starting to bed in, good practice standards and guidelines developed, and increased investor expectations around what they're looking for from companies means investors are now more willing to hold companies to account for a plan insufficiently aligned with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And honing back into Australia in particular, the voting results do tend to agree with this view. So saying climate votes have actually averaged over 20% dissent in Australia in 2022, and around 57% of these saying climate votes actually did receive high dissent. So these are quite significant results. And it does mean Australia does appear to be somewhat of an outlier when compared to with other markets with the level of dissent on climate plans received. So Santos and Woodside in particular received very high oppositional votes from shareholders, with both companies receiving over 40% dissent. But to quickly go back to your question over director accountability, I do believe that shareholders can actually reinforce their views by using other votes in combination to voting against the saying climate resolution. So they could also oppose the re-election of a board member, and also there's the option of filing and voting on shareholder proposals, which should be seen as complementary rather than an escalation necessarily. So the case at AGL represents an approach to this where shareholders were concerned by how the board responding to the climate transition by actually seeking to change the composition of the board. And also there can be cases where there will be no saying climate votes, so holding a director individually accountable could be a useful option to shareholders to raise this concern. So while shareholder dissent has actually increased on saying climate votes globally, and dissent has been high in Australia, no company is actually yet to suffer a defeat. So investors do need to be cautious on climate transition plan votes due to the risk of rubber stamping plans that are not sufficiently aligned with the Paris climate goals.
In the previous webinar, we discussed how there's been concerns over Australia's public policy on climate change, in particular that inaction and policy uncertainty was acting as a barrier to climate investment opportunities and analysis, for that matter, by organizations such as Climate Action Tracker and Climate Targets Panel, suggesting that Australia was insufficiently aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that really plays into everything you've been saying there. The war is only just beginning, really, when it comes to shareholder voting on climate issues at company AGMs in Australia. However, with the change in government in 2022, there's been signs of movement in regard to the climate change bill of 2022, which enshrined a net zero commitment for Australia. Has there been any further movement in this area? Is there more certainty now? Do companies need to worry about what's to come from their shareholders?
So, yeah, I think you're right here, Alex, but there does appear to be a shift in climate policy since the Labour government was elected in 2022. So, as you mentioned, the climate change bill enshrined an emission reduction target of 43% from 2005 levels by 2030, and also to reach net zero emissions by 2050. There's also been various climate policy reforms at state level as well. So legislation does provide greater certainty for investors and also participants in the energy market, as well as a more stable policy setting. And this view is also reflected in a recent survey of institutional investors in Australia conducted by the Investor Group on Climate Change, which found that policy certainty is improving, although off a low base. So in 2021, they found that around 70% of investors highlighted policy uncertainty as a key barrier to investment in Australia, compared to 56% in 2022. So it has improved, but there's still significant concerns. Then another important development that's happening is the Treasury recently launched a consultation on the design and also implementation of standardized, internationally aligned requirements for disclosure of climate-related financial risks and opportunities in Australia. So when we're talking about what to expect from companies and investors going forward in climate change, so a common and also an important tool to manage both individual and systemic climate-related financial risks is the disclosure of those risks. And since the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, released its recommendations in 2017, there has been a steady increase in demand for disclosures by investors and jurisdictions mandating TCFD-aligned disclosures. So it appears that Australia is going to be joining this line of travel with seeking to introduce this requirement. So the current consultation is open, and it's open until 17th of February. So those are two key climate regulatory movements, but there's also been several other ESG initiatives happening, such as the APRA's guidance on climate change financial risks, which affects banks, insurers, and also superannuation trustees. There's also been statements made by various regulators in Australia around greenwashing, as well as the Australian Sustainability Financial Initiative, which is seeking to align Australia's financial systems with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also various conventions on human rights. And as part of this, the initiative is also exploring the implementation and design of a sustainable finance taxonomy in Australia. So we've seen a taxonomy introduced in Europe. So there's lots of movement around ESG in the Australian market at the moment. So it's interesting times ahead for ESG.
It is such an about turn for Australian public policy that it's now supporting climate alignment in the finance sector. The mandatory TCFD alignment is one change in particular that's very exciting to see as an Australian myself. Looking ahead to 2023, though, do we expect to see continued support for say on climate resolutions as a result of these policy shifts?
So when we consider saying climate votes and also these regulatory movements, we need to recognise that the Australian market is exposed to material, physical and transitional climate risks. So this legislation could spur on greater and more consistent disclosure from companies and how they're managing and responding to climate risks and opportunities, but also at the same time increasing investor expectations in this area, as investors around the world are increasingly incorporating climate considerations in their investment decision-making and also engagement activity. So companies and investors in Australia will need to prepare for this heightened level of disclosure and also data demands. So based on the voting trends seen on a global basis in 2021 and 2022, shareholder dissent on saying climate could continue to increase, and in particular corporate laggards, those who don't sufficiently detail how the company intends to transition to a low-carbon world, could be on the receiving end of high dissent on these votes. But what we may also see, as mentioned previously, is that investors may take a more holistic approach to voting around this issue and couple a vote against the saying climate resolution with a vote against a director deemed most responsible for climate strategy, such as if there's a sustainability committee on the board. But also voting on directors for climate risk management may also become more common just by the fact that not every company will hold a say in climate votes, or a company may not actually hold a vote every year, as there have been different approaches to these resolutions taken by companies, with some holding a vote every 3 years, others annually. So we do expect climate change to feature more in shareholder voting and engagement activity.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a really key takeaway from today's webinar, I think. Moving over to the social side of things, we've also seen plenty of scandals involving mining companies in Australia in recent years. You've mentioned Indigenous rights issues. There's also been gender issues. Do we expect to see this trend to continue into 2023?
So in terms of investor action in 2023, what we're likely to see is investors engaging with companies in these sectors around company culture, as management and boards should be setting the tone from the top and ensuring high standards throughout the company, as well as engagement on how companies are engaging and discussing items with First Nations and Indigenous peoples, and ensuring free, prior and informed consent in relation to the control of territories, natural resources, and also the protection of cultural heritage. And that's a particular high risk for companies in the mining industry. Obviously, the key example of this being Rio Tinto's destruction of sacred rock shelters in Western Australia, which they conducted as part of a mine expansion in opposition to the local Aboriginal peoples. So this instance did result as a catalyst for greater expectations and also legislative action around the issue. So investors can look for indicators relating to risk assessments, governance, and also board oversight, and whether the company's policies and practices are aligned with good practice and international standards. So where concerns are held or where there has been an instance of a material controversy, we could see these filter down into votes against directors or remuneration, as well as the filing of shareholder proposals. Social issues such as the ones mentioned here do bring about material litigation, reputational and operational risks for companies. So it's important that investors and companies stay on top of these.
Brilliant. Another really key takeaway for 2023. And finally, just to wrap up our kind of look ahead and predictions for this year in Australia, biodiversity is another area that has been rising up the ranks of importance in the last year or so. In fact, biodiversity, and I mentioned this in the previous webinar we did for the UK 2022 Proxy season, was the first topic which Minerva held a short briefing webinar on back in 2021. And I've attached the link to that webinar in the documents below this video if anyone in the audience is interested in checking that out. But anyway, how is this topic likely to evolve in the coming year for Australia?
Well, that's an interesting one because 2022 did end on a high note for biodiversity, with the United Nations agreeing to the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF, on December 19th. So that's a landmark decision that the world has been waiting on for a while now. So after COP15 on biodiversity was delayed several times due to COVID restrictions, the GBF is a list of 24 recommendations to governments on how to legislate for biodiversity. So this could spark greater action throughout the global economy, much like the Paris Agreement did for climate change action. So in anticipation of new biodiversity regulations, Minerva does expect to see the topic popping up more at general meetings in the coming year. So I think this is only actually amplified by the fact that the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures plans to publish their final recommendations for companies and investors in September 2023, With that said, the fact that these recommendations won't be being published towards the end of the year, it does mean that we will likely not see great uptake of the recommendations until, say, 2024 or 2025 at the latest. But to go back to Australia in particular, so given that the fact that they're still only really catching up on the climate front at the moment, it may take some time to later catch up also on the biodiversity front. But we'll see how the chip falls. And we actually have seen some investor groups in Australia already publish guidance for investor action in this area. So one thing that Australia does have going for it is its proposed biodiversity credit system. But that's still in the early stages, being simply a proposal being put forward by the federal government. So much work is still needed for biodiversity to truly feature as a hot topic of AGM season in 2023. But I think biodiversity is a really important issue in Australia, especially when we consider that there's an abundance of different species of plants and animals, many of which are unique in Australia. So it's important that investors and companies are looking at this issue.
Thanks, Thomas, for being our guide for today and taking us through what to expect in the 2023 proxy season. Now, before we wrap up, I must mention that with the growing importance of ESG, Minerva is well positioned to provide you with all your proxy voting and stewardship needs. We're connected and knowledgeable when it comes to responsible and sustainable investing, and a founding member of the industry-leading Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance. We've also been widely awarded as leaders in sustainable investment solutions, so you can contact us via hello@minerva.info if you're interested in hearing more. Thanks again, Thomas.
Thanks, Alex.